Welcome to PM Ready, your guide to becoming PMP certified. This is the lesson that covers the process table in depth. Part 2. In the Scope Management Knowledge area, under the Planning Process group, in addition to Plan Scope Management, you have 3 additional planning processes: Collect Requirements, Define Scope, and Create WBS. The Collect Requirements process has as its primary input the project charter. As its main outputs, you have the requirements documentation and the requirements traceability matrix. Basically, at this point, after Collect Requirements, you have exhaustive documentation about the requirements for the project. However, not all of the requirements that you've identified will be selected for this project. That's where Define Scope comes in, which takes these requirements documents as input and then decides which of these to include in the project scope. And this very detailed description of the project scope is output as the project scope statement. This project scope statement is then the input to the Create WBS process, which takes all of this detail and organizes it into a hierarchical structure, the work breakdown structure. Combined with the project scope statement, as well as the work breakdown structure dictionary, which includes lots of detail about these requirements, these elements of scope, these 3 form the scope baseline, which is the output of Create WBS. Notice that it's a lot easier to remember these processes and what they do and what order they do them in by remembering the artifacts or project deliverables, these documents that are created along the way, and how they flow from one process to another. Next, we have the schedule planning processes. In addition to plan schedule management, you have 4 more planning processes for schedule planning. They are Define Activities, Sequence Activities, Estimate Activity Durations, and Develop Schedule. Again, it's easier to remember these if you look at the workflow of the main deliverables and artifacts and how they flow through these processes. The scope baseline, the project schedule if you've already got one and so you're reiterating through these processes, plus resource requirements are inputs to define activities. This information is then used to create an activity list, as well as activity attributes and a milestone list. These activities are then sequenced in order using the Sequence Activities process to create a project schedule network diagram, which does not yet include durations, but just has the activities in their proper order. So then the next step is to estimate activity durations, which outputs your duration estimates plus your basis of estimates. These are inputs to your Develop Schedule process, which develops your schedule baseline, your project schedule, schedule data, and project calendars. Next, we have the cost planning processes. Above and beyond Plan Cost Management, you have 2 more processes: Estimate Costs and Determine Budget. The Estimate Costs process uses the scope baseline, project schedule, and resource requirements as inputs, and creates cost estimates and the supporting document of basis of estimates. These are then used as inputs to the Determine Budget process, which creates the cost baseline as well as your project funding requirements. Next, we come to resource planning. We, of course, have your plan resource management process, and then, in addition to that, one more planning process called estimate activity resources. Where this comes into play, if you look at the workflow, is that plan resource management creates the resource management plan and your team charter, which are then used as inputs to your estimate activity resources process, which then outputs your resource requirements, your basis of estimates, and your resource breakdown structure. Risk planning also includes several distinct processes. In addition to plan risk management, you have 4 more: identify risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, and plan risk responses. These start with identify risks. These risks are recorded in your risk register and analyzed and summarized in your risk report. This information is then used as input to your perform qualitative risk analysis, and this analysis and its results are then used to update the information in your risk register and risk report. Then, for some of your risks, you may perform quantitative risk analysis, and the results of this, again, are summarized and used to update your risk register and risk report. Then you have your process of plan risk responses, and these responses are recorded in your risk register and risk report. Notice that in your risk planning, you don't have a lot of different artifacts, but these different analyses and steps are used to update your risk register and risk report at each step along the way. After planning, we now move on to the executing process group. In this column of the PMI process table, we have the following processes: direct and manage project work, which is responsible for the work of doing all of the project work, and it includes the executing processes of scope, schedule, and cost, which do not have their own separate processes in the process table. Remember, this is that group of 3 knowledge areas that doesn't have anything in these cells or boxes in the process table, because they're part of the integrating process of direct and manage project work. In other knowledge areas, you have manage quality, manage communications, manage stakeholder engagement, implement risk responses, conduct procurements, and then under resources, you have 3: acquire resources, develop team, and manage team. And then there's one other called manage project knowledge, which is a relatively new process that has been added to the integration knowledge area. Next, we move on to the 4th column of the PMI process table, the monitoring and controlling process group. Recall that all of the knowledge areas have at least one monitoring and controlling process. First, we have, in the integration knowledge area, monitor and control project work, which oversees and coordinates all of the other monitoring and controlling processes. Then we have a set that are all named with the verb control at the beginning. We have control scope, control schedule, control costs, control quality, control resources, and control procurements. But then we have a few that use the verb monitor instead of control, and these are monitor communications, monitor risks, and monitor stakeholder engagement. And then we have a couple of others. One is validate scope. Notice that we had control scope, but we also have validate scope. And then we have perform integrated change control, which is responsible for reviewing and approving change requests and is part of the integration knowledge area. And finally, we come to the closing process group, which has one and only one process: close project or phase. And you can remember this one. Since there's only one, it's only natural that it be part of the integration knowledge area. Also remember that it's the integration knowledge area that has processes across all 5 process groups. Procurements are not closed in the closed project or phase process, as used to be the case, but rather procurements are closed in the control procurements process under monitoring and controlling. Closed project or phase checks to make sure that this has been done, but it's actually done in control procurements. Here's a key that will help you to remember some of these process names, and that is that all of the process names have been standardized so that they now begin with a verb followed by one or more nouns, such as develop project management plan. Also notice that all of the subsidiary project management plans all follow the same pattern of plan, fill in the blank, management, such as plan scope management, plan schedule management, and so on, one for each of the knowledge areas. There's only one exception to this pattern, and that is for the stakeholders. It's called plan stakeholder engagement rather than management. There are 4 process names that start with the verb develop. These are develop project charter, develop project management plan, develop schedule, and develop team. When it comes to the monitoring and controlling processes, all of these processes are named using either the monitor verb or the control verb at the beginning, with 2 exceptions: perform integrated change control and validate scope. We should also take a look at the integration knowledge area, which is rather special in a number of ways, not only because it has processes in all 5 process groups, but as it is the integration knowledge area, and it has oversight to so many other knowledge areas and their processes, it also has some things about it that are unique. First of all, it is the one knowledge area that has 2 processes that start with develop. Develop project charter and develop project management plan. It also has 2 processes that have 2 verbs in them, with an and in between. These are direct and manage project work, as well as monitor and control project work. This is the only time that you see processes that have this combination of multiple verbs. It's also the only knowledge area that has an or. Close project or phase. And strangely, it is the one that has in the monitoring and controlling process group, the control verb is included as a word at the end. So it has perform as a verb at the beginning, but control at the end as well in perform integrated change control. Resource management deserves a closer look. In the executing process group, it has 3 processes called acquire resources, develop team, and manage team, which are performed in this order. Now you may be asking yourself, with so many processes to remember, what order am I supposed to do them in? Well, let's start with the things that are done before you even hit the process table. Before any of the other processes start, you need to have your needs assessment, business case, and benefits management plan. Once the preliminaries are done, then you start immediately with develop project charter. In order to do your project charter, you'll need to have identified at least your key stakeholders, so identify stakeholders needs to begin during this time as well, though your project charter will typically be completed and approved before you've finished identifying all of your stakeholders. Next, we come to planning. In which order should you do all of these different planning processes? Well, as you look at the Develop Project Management Plan process, it includes all of these subsidiary plans. So one approach is to develop all of these plans all up front before you do anything else. And you can do this. And in many cases, it's the right thing to do, with one exception. And that is plan procurement management, because this is dependent upon the scope, which won't have been defined yet. So if you want to create all of your plans early, you certainly can, except for the procurement management plan. Now, if you have developed all of your management plans early, once those are done, you can then begin your other planning processes, and these have a pretty natural order to them. The first would be to collect requirements, then define scope. Then the soonest you could do your procurement management planning would be once you've defined the scope. Then you can create the WBS. Define your activities, sequence your activities, estimate activity resources, estimate activity durations, develop schedule, estimate costs, and determine budget. Now, plan procurement management could happen as soon as right after define scope, or it could be after create WBS, or you may wait until after estimate activity resources, because that's when you'll have a clearer picture on which resources you have internally and which ones you'll need to acquire from outside of your organization. Or you might even wait until after you've estimated your costs and determined your budget, so that you know how much money you have and whether or not you can procure what you need, or if you need to take a different approach or strategy to your procurement. Despite the fact that some will tell you that there is a specific order in which planning must be done, you can see that that's simply not the case. There are some things that have a natural order, and other things that where you put them depends on your project and its details. Then the next thing you'll want to do is plan risk management. Identify risks, perform qualitative risk analysis, perform quantitative risk analysis, and plan risk responses. Actually, this is probably the best point to do risk planning, whether you're doing your risk management plan early or late, because it's only after you've come up with your scope and your schedule and your costs that you're in the best position to really identify the risks. You will certainly need to go back and revisit some of those prior processes as you put in the risk responses and update your scope, schedule, and cost prior to baselining them. Although you may come across some risks along the way that you'll want to record, you won't really be in a position to thoroughly identify and manage and analyze your risks until you've gone through all of these other processes first. Then comes plan procurement management. And in some cases, planned procurement management might even need to be done after acquire resources, which is part of the executing process group. But most of the time, you should be able to do it here at the end of your planning processes. But notice that this needs to come at the end because you'll need to identify and come up with risk responses that may affect how you approach procurement, including your procurement strategy, the contract type that you'll use, and so on. For executing, monitoring, and controlling processes, all of the rest of these all happen simultaneously. So there's no particular order that you need to worry about. Other than that, there are a few groups such as acquire resources, develop team, and manage team that happen in this order. And then at the end, you have close project or phase. A few key things to remember as we summarize this lesson are that you have 2 initiating processes, 1 closing process, that all of these processes are iterative. You don't just go through them once in one order and never come back to them. That all knowledge areas have planning processes, that all knowledge areas have executing processes, except for scope, schedule, and cost, which are covered by the integration knowledge area. All knowledge areas have monitoring and controlling processes, and that your process names have been standardized with a few interesting exceptions. For more information, you can refer to these pages of the PMBOK guide. PM Ready is a publication of PM Guaranteed and is based on the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.